Let me tell you something about the night I almost became someone else entirely. I was standing in a ballroom, chandeliers above me, champagne in my hand, 60 people watching me smile. And the man I was supposed to marry was 3 feet away, nodding while his sister handed me a job description dressed up as a wedding toast. I couldn't believe it. And yet, there it was. Tradition, legacy, duties, expectations. All the words they use when what they really mean is control. I thought I was walking into a celebration. I didn't know I was walking into a trap. A trap that had been planned, I later found out, before he even put a ring on my finger. Here's what they didn't see coming. I left. Not with tears, not with a scene. Just my heels on that marble floor and the quiet sound of a woman deciding, in real time, to stop performing gratitude for people who had already decided how to use her. By the time I got home, there were 30 missed calls on my phone. 30, and I didn't answer a single one, because while they were panicking, I was opening my laptop, pulling up financial documents, and beginning the kind of audit that changes everything. What I found was shocking. What I did about it was deliberate. And what happened next, the recordings, the screenshots, the legal filings, the moment they folded, is the kind of story they don't tell you when they're handing you a champagne flute and calling it tradition. This is about betrayal that was structured before love was even real. This is about infidelity of a different kind, the kind that lives in documents and trusts and group chats where someone you loved called you a target. This is about the truth that nobody wanted me to find, and what I did the moment I found it. My name is Sophie, and this is the story of how I got cheated, how I got humiliated, how I was lied to, and how I took back every single thing that was mine. The ballroom was stunning. Crystal chandeliers, white roses everywhere, champagne that probably cost more than my rent. Everyone kept saying how lucky I was, how perfect Daniel was, how this engagement party was the stuff of dreams. And honestly, part of me wanted to believe it. I'd spent months telling myself that the nervousness in my chest was just pre-wedding jitters, nothing more. But that night, standing in a designer dress I'd bought myself, something felt off, like a beautiful painting with a crack running right through the middle. Daniel's family, the Hargroves, had insisted on planning everything, every detail, every seating arrangement, every speech. I told myself it was generosity. I told myself they just loved their son and wanted the best for us. But when his sister, Victoria, clinked her glass and smiled that practiced smile of hers, I felt my stomach drop before she even opened her mouth. Family drama has a smell to it, I swear. And that room reeked of it. Victoria spoke about tradition like it was scripture. How the woman entering the Hargrove family takes on certain duties, managing the household accounts, hosting the quarterly dinners, maintaining the family's social calendar. She used words like partnership and legacy, but every sentence landed like a brick. I stood there holding my champagne flute so tightly I thought it might shatter, my smile frozen in place, my mind suddenly very, very alert. I looked at Daniel, my fiancé, the man I'd imagined building a life with. He was nodding, slowly, gently, the way you nod when someone else is doing the talking you were too scared to do yourself. And that nod told me everything. This wasn't Victoria improvising, this was rehearsed. This was a job description wrapped in rose petals and Prosecco, delivered in front of 60 people who were all watching me, waiting to see if I'd just smile and accept it. The room felt heavier with every word. Not romantic heavy. Trap heavy. I hadn't been invited to a celebration. I'd been invited to an audition. And the role they were casting me in wasn't wife. It was something else entirely. Something I didn't have a name for yet, but my gut already recognized it. The kind of betrayal that doesn't announce itself loudly. It arrives dressed in champagne and tradition, smiling. I kept my face neutral. I let Victoria finish. I even clapped. But inside, Something had shifted permanently. A door had closed and another one, a dangerous one, had cracked open. And I thought, before this night is over, I'm going to ask 2 questions that nobody in this room is prepared to answer. I waited until Victoria's applause faded and the room settled back into its comfortable murmur of clinking glasses and soft laughter. I set my champagne down, deliberately, slowly, and I walked to the center of that room like I owned every inch of it. Because here's the thing about public humiliation. The only way to survive it is to refuse to perform it. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to shrink. I was going to ask my 2 questions with the calm of someone conducting a board meeting, and I was going to let the silence do the rest. "Victoria," I said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "those are fascinating traditions. Are they documented anywhere? A family charter? A written agreement? Something I could review?" The room went still. Not awkward still, frozen still. The kind of stillness that happens when everyone realizes, simultaneously, that something real is being said out loud. Victoria blinked. Her smile cracked at the edges. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his shoes. My second question came out softer, which somehow made it hit harder. "And what exactly will Daniel's role be in all of this?" I turned to look at him directly. Not with rage, with curiosity. Pure, cold, devastating curiosity. The kind of look that says, "I'm not asking to fight. I'm asking because I genuinely need to know if you have an answer." And he didn't. He opened his mouth, closed it, glanced at his mother, and said absolutely nothing. The silence was the confession. I'd been cheated out of an honest conversation for months. I could see that now, clearly, like a fog had lifted. Every time I'd tried to discuss finances or future plans, Daniel had deflected or smiled or said, "We'll figure it out." I thought it was laid back. I now understood it was strategic. He'd never had to answer hard questions because his family had always controlled the room. Until tonight. I couldn't believe how exposed it all looked once the curtain was yanked back. The room was still watching. Some faces showed sympathy. Others showed something colder, judgment maybe, or loyalty to the Hargroves. Victoria recovered first, laughing lightly and saying something about, "Just a little speech, not a legal document." But the damage was done, not to me, to them. Because everyone in that room had just watched Daniel Hargrove fail a simple test of dignity, and I had passed mine with flying colors. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I simply asked what any reasonable woman had every right to ask, and the fact that 2 simple questions could shatter an entire family's composure told me everything I needed to know about what kind of marriage was waiting for me on the other side of that altar. I picked up my clutch, I smoothed the front of my dress, and I walked out. No dramatic exit music, no slammed doors, no tears streaking my mascara. Just the quiet, deliberate sound of my heels on that marble floor as I made my way through the ballroom and into the cool night air outside. 60 people watched me leave, and I didn't look back at a single one. That walk was the first truly free moment I'd had all evening. Maybe in months. My phone started buzzing before I even reached the valet. First Daniel, then Victoria, then Daniel's mother, Margaret. A woman who had always smiled at me with her teeth but never her eyes. Then a number I didn't recognize. Then Daniel again. Then a group chat that exploded with notifications. I slid the phone into my clutch without reading a single message, and I stood under the night sky and breathed. Just breathed. The kind of breathing you do when you realize you've been holding it for longer than you knew. The texts, when I finally read them in the car, were a masterclass in gaslighting. "You embarrassed us in front of everyone." "This isn't like you, Sophie. Victoria was just trying to welcome you into the family. You're being so dramatic." And my personal favorite, the one from Daniel himself, "I think you misunderstood." That word, misunderstood, landed like a slap. Because I hadn't misunderstood anything. I had, for the first time in our entire relationship, understood exactly what was happening. I cried for exactly 12 minutes in the shower. Then something shut off inside me. I've always been like that. Once the tears stop, the analysis starts. So I went to the kitchen, made tea, opened my laptop, and pulled up every financial document connected to Daniel and me. Joint accounts, contribution records, property filings. I wasn't emotional anymore. I was focused. Something had clicked into a different gear inside me, cold, methodical, and absolutely clear-eyed. Revenge, real, intelligent, lasting payback, doesn't look like screaming in a ballroom. It looks like a woman at a kitchen table at midnight, sipping chamomile tea, reading financial documents with a highlighter. The family thought my walkout was a tantrum. They had no idea it was the opening move. And by the time the sun came up, I'd already found the first number that didn't add up. Numbers don't lie. People do, spectacularly, creatively, with smiles on their faces and love songs on their lips. But numbers sit still and wait for someone to pay attention. I'd been so busy being in love, planning a future, believing the story I was being told, that I'd looked at our joint account statements the way you look at background noise: present, registered, ignored. That night, I stopped ignoring. And what I found turned my stomach cold. There were transfers. Small at first, a few $100s here, a couple thousand there, always on odd dates, always to an account labeled only with an alphanumeric code. I'd seen them before and assumed they were bills or subscriptions Daniel handled. But when I totaled them up across 18 months, I was looking at nearly $42,000 quietly siphoned out of accounts I had largely funded. I couldn't believe it. Except I could. I absolutely could. Because the evidence was right there, highlighted in yellow, undeniable. I called Chloe at 1 a.m. Chloe Reyes, my college roommate, the woman who once tore apart a fraudulent condo deal for a living, now one of the sharpest asset protection attorneys in the city. She answered on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting for exactly this kind of call for exactly this kind of night. I dumped everything on her in one breathless sentence: the speech, the walkout, the transfers, the property documents I was staring at. There was a pause. Then she said, very calmly, "Don't touch anything. Don't respond to anyone. And do not, under any circumstances, make an emotional decision before Monday morning." Chloe's rule wasn't just legal strategy, it was survival strategy. The Hargroves were counting on me to react. They'd seen my walkout and assumed what came next would be tears, accusations, begging, or silence. What they hadn't accounted for was the possibility that I would audit them. That I would pull records the way a forensic accountant pulls records. Systematically, emotionally detached, building a case instead of a complaint. Family betrayal stings worst when it's financial, because it isn't just emotional, it's structural. This wasn't chaos, it was architecture. By 3 a.m., I had a spreadsheet. By 4 a.m., I had a folder of screenshots. By 5 a.m., I had a very short, very focused list of questions for Chloe that I sent in a single email with the subject line: "I think I've been set up." I turned off my lamp, lay down on top of my covers still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. The word trap kept circling in my mind. Not an accusation, a hypothesis. And a hypothesis, unlike a feeling, can be proven. I just had to keep pulling the thread. And what I was about to find out about that townhouse was going to change everything. Monday morning, Chloe called me at 7:58 a.m. I'd barely slept. She had. She had also, apparently, already pulled the county property records, cross-referenced the deed history, and run the trust documentation I'd emailed her through 3 different legal filters before breakfast. When she said, "Sophie, sit down," I was already sitting. But I gripped the edge of the kitchen table anyway. The townhouse, the property I had contributed $63,000 toward in down payment and renovation costs, the home I had picked the tiles for, painted the hallway of, signed my name on every contractor invoice for, was technically held inside a land trust. That part I knew. What I hadn't known, what had been buried in language that would make most people's eyes glaze over, was that Daniel was named as the sole directing party of that trust. Not us. Him. Which meant he could legally sell, transfer, or assign that property without my signature, my knowledge, or my consent. I sat with that information for a full minute without speaking. Chloe let me. She's good at that, knowing when to let silence work. The word that kept repeating in my head wasn't anger. It was architecture. This had been designed. The trust wasn't a coincidence or a technicality someone had overlooked. It was a structure, deliberately built, that turned my financial contribution into leverage he could hold over me or pull out from under me whenever convenient. I had been cheated structurally on paper before we'd even said our vows. The justice of it, or the cruel absence of it, was almost poetic. Here was a family that had spoken so publicly about tradition and legacy and partnership, and behind that beautiful language was a legal document that said, she puts in the money, he keeps the asset. The infidelity wasn't physical, it was financial. It was the betrayal of every conversation we'd had about our future and our home, when the document said plainly that it was his future and his home, and I was just the funding mechanism. Chloe said we had options, and she said it the way doctors say it when what they mean is, it's serious, but it's not over. We could file to unwind the trust contribution based on unjust enrichment. We could pursue a constructive trust argument. We could document every dollar with receipts I already had. But Sophie, she said before we hung up, I need you to do one more thing first. She paused. They're going to call you to a family dinner. They always do. When they do, go. And take your phone and record every single word. The invitation came exactly when Chloe predicted it. Thursday evening, a text from Margaret, Daniel's mother, written in that particular tone that sounds like a suggestion but lands like a summons. We think it's time we all sat down together. Dinner Sunday, the house, 6 p.m. I read it twice. I showed Chloe. She replied with a single word. Perfect. And just like that, what had been billed as a family reconciliation dinner became something very different. It became a deposition I was walking into voluntarily, wired and ready. Chloe coached me for 2 hours on Saturday afternoon. The rules were simple but required everything I had. Don't raise your voice, don't get emotional, don't accuse. Let them talk. People who believe they have the upper hand always talk too much. The Hargroves were confident. They thought they'd weathered the engagement party embarrassment and were now in cleanup mode. They expected a shaken, softened version of me to show up needing peace. What they were getting was a woman with a fully charged phone, a recording app running the moment I stepped through their front door, and a very specific set of silences designed to pull confessions out of people who couldn't help themselves. The dinner was exactly what I expected, and worse. Margaret opened with warmth, which was its own kind of theater. Victoria was so glad we were talking. Daniel was quiet, which I now recognized as his natural position in any room his family occupied. And then slowly, like water finding cracks, the real agenda surfaced. I was being too independent. I had embarrassed them publicly. The property arrangement was just smart planning. Surely I understood that, didn't I? I just smiled and nodded and let them talk, while my phone sat in my cardigan pocket, capturing every syllable in perfect clarity. The most shocking moment came when Daniel's father, Richard, leaned across the table and said, quite casually, quite directly, that it would be easier for everyone if the townhouse were restructured before any wedding. The word restructured landed like a grenade in slow motion. He meant it as a power move. He said it with the confidence of a man who had done this before, in other rooms, with other people, and walked away clean every time. What he didn't know was that he was saying it into a microphone, and that his casual definition of restructured was going to become Exhibit A. I drove home with 47 minutes of audio and a clarity I hadn't felt in months. This was no longer a family drama I was surviving. It was a case I was building. Once you see the architecture, you can dismantle it. I wanted every dollar documented, every admission time-stamped, every manipulation exposed with the kind of evidence that doesn't bend under pressure. The Hargroves had spent years perfecting the art of control, but they'd never had anyone pay close enough attention to the machinery underneath. I was ready for things to get ugly. What I wasn't ready for was how fast it happened. Within 72 hours of that Sunday dinner, Chloe called me with news that made my hands go cold. Daniel had filed an assignment, a legal document transferring half of my beneficial interest in the townhouse trust directly to his father, Richard. Just like that. Without my knowledge, without my signature, without even the courtesy of a warning. He had taken what I'd built, signed away half of it to his father, and apparently expected me to find out through the mail. The backstabbing was so brazen, it was almost impressive. This was no longer about a controlling family or a manipulated fiancé. This was a coordinated legal maneuver, executed while I was presumably still reeling from the dinner, still deciding whether to fight or fold. They had timed it to beat me to the courthouse. But what they hadn't counted on was that Chloe had already spent the previous week preparing our counterplay, and the moment that assignment hit the county recorder's office, she was ready to respond within the hour. The counterstrike was swift and surgical. Demand letters went out to Daniel, Richard, and the trust administrator simultaneously. Chloe filed a lis pendens on the property, a legal flag that told every title company and potential buyer in the county that this property was in active dispute and couldn't be cleanly transferred or sold. Bank accounts connected to the joint financial history were frozen pending disclosure, and a formal notice of fraudulent conveyance was filed, arguing that the assignment had been made specifically to defeat my legal interest. The Hargroves had started a war. We finished the opening salvo before they'd had their morning coffee. Daniel called me 17 times that day. I watched every call go to voicemail with a stillness that surprised even me. This was karmic momentum, not the Hollywood kind, but the slow, methodical kind that comes from having truth, documentation, and a brilliant attorney on your side. He finally sent a text. "Sophie, please. This is getting out of hand." Out of hand. As if he hadn't been the one to pull the trigger. As if the person defending herself was the one creating the chaos. The sheer audacity of it would have made me laugh if I hadn't been so completely locked in. The narrative inside the Hargrove family, I later found out, was that I had snapped, that the engagement party had triggered something in me, and now I was being irrational and vindictive. That framing was deliberate. If I was unhinged, my evidence was compromised. If I was hysterical, my attorney was just feeding a delusion. But real justice doesn't need you to be likable. It needs you to be right. And I was right, documented, recorded, and legally fortified. The real battle, though, hadn't started yet. Because when Daniel panicked, Victoria picked up the keyboard, and that was a different kind of weapon entirely. I woke up to 43 notifications and a screenshot from my cousin. Victoria had posted. It was a long post, the kind carefully crafted to seem spontaneous, full of ellipses and heart emojis and the language of a wounded family, painting me as a woman who had blindsided them, who had used Daniel for financial gain, who was now weaponizing the legal system out of spite and greed. She didn't name me directly. She didn't have to. Every person we mutually knew saw it within the hour. The shaming was public, deliberate, and designed to preempt my story with their version of events. I felt the sting of it. I won't lie. Being humiliated in private is survivable. Being humiliated in a Facebook post that your coworkers and neighbors are quietly reading over their morning coffee is a different animal. For about 11 minutes, I sat in bed feeling the specific nausea of public disgrace, the burning need to respond, to correct the record, to make everyone see what I actually was and what they actually did. Then I called Chloe, and Chloe said, "Good. They just moved from a legal fight to a public one. That's a gift." Chloe's response to Victoria's post wasn't emotional. It was clinical. She drafted a short, precise statement on letterhead from her firm, addressed to the public, stating simply that her client had discovered a pattern of financial irregularities connected to a jointly funded property and was pursuing all available legal remedies. No names, no drama, no emotion, just the cold, clean language of someone who has evidence and isn't afraid to use it. It was posted by a mutual contact in the legal community and shared in 3 local professional groups. The internet's temperature changed within hours. What people don't understand about the war for narrative is that credibility doesn't come from volume. It comes from tone. Victoria's post was long, emotional, and defensive, which read as guilty to anyone paying attention. Chloe's statement was 4 sentences and a firm logo. When placed side by side, only one of them sounded like someone with something to hide. The dignified silence from my end, contrasted with the Hargroves' increasingly frantic public performance, was doing more damage to their reputation than anything I could have screamed in a ballroom. The comments on Victoria's post were, slowly, turning. People who knew Daniel were asking quiet questions. Former colleagues of mine were posting professional endorsements of my character without being asked. And somewhere in the middle of all that digital noise, something clicked. They had underestimated me completely. They had assumed that exposing me to shame would break me, because that's what shame does to people who haven't decided yet who they are. But I had decided. The moment I walked out of that ballroom, I had decided. And what was coming next was going to give me every piece of leverage I needed to close this permanently. Victoria's post had reached Daniel's office too. People talk, screenshots travel. It came from the last place I expected, a DM from a woman named Priya, who had worked with Daniel at his firm for 3 years. We'd met twice at company events, shaken hands, exchanged pleasantries. I had no reason to expect anything from her. But the message she sent at 11:47 on a Tuesday night contained 4 screenshots that stopped my heart completely, then restarted it with a fury I hadn't felt before. The screenshots were from a group chat. Daniel, 2 colleagues, a golf buddy, dated 14 months ago, before the engagement, before the property purchase, and in them, Daniel was bragging. Not venting, not confiding, bragging. He'd described in casual, almost cheerful language how he was setting up a situation with a woman he was planning to marry, ensuring that any assets acquired during the relationship would be safely structured before the ring went on. He used the word smart 3 times. He used the phrase, "she'll never check once." I couldn't believe what I was reading, except I could, because everything I'd uncovered in the past 2 weeks had been pointing to exactly this. Premeditation. That was the word Chloe used when I forwarded the screenshots to her at midnight. Sophie, this isn't just financial misconduct. This is premeditated fraud. The distinction matters enormously, legally and emotionally. There's a version of this story where Daniel was weak, controlled by his family, making bad decisions under pressure. I'd been half tempted to believe that version, because it was easier. The screenshots erased that version permanently. This had been planned before I was even wearing his ring. The betrayal wasn't an accident, it was a strategy. The karma of it, the sheer irony, was almost too much. Daniel had trusted his private bravado to a group chat that included someone who, apparently, had her own reasons for making sure I found out. I didn't ask Priya why she came forward, I just thanked her. Whatever her motivation, she had handed me the most devastating piece of leverage in the entire case. Proof that the fraud wasn't reactive. It was designed, with me specifically as the target, long before any ring or ballroom or champagne speech. The Hargroves weren't just a controlling family. They were a coordinated operation. Chloe incorporated the screenshots into our formal filing immediately. The legal effect was significant. It transformed the case from a property dispute into evidence of a scheme. But the psychological effect on the Hargrove family, once their attorney notified them that we had the chat logs, was something else entirely. Daniel went completely silent. Richard, I was told, left a family dinner early looking pale. And Victoria, confident, performative, post-writing Victoria, went quiet on social media for the first time in weeks. The silence from their side was the loudest thing I'd heard since I walked out of that ballroom. But they weren't done. And neither was I. By then, nearly 3 weeks had passed since the engagement party. 3 weeks that had felt like 3 years. And then Victoria called me directly. Not Daniel, not Richard, not their attorney. Victoria. She called at 6:15 in the evening, and her voice was different from anything I'd heard from her before. Not charming, not performative. Flat. Deliberate. She told me calmly that she had access to information about a period of my life several years prior. A hospitalization, a diagnosis, a chapter I had closed and moved past and had zero obligation to explain to anyone. And she said, equally calmly, that if I didn't drop the legal action by Friday, that information would be shared. I let her finish. I didn't respond immediately. And in the silence, I could hear her breathing. Slightly faster than normal, the breathing of someone who believes they've just played an unbeatable card. What she couldn't see was that I was sitting at my kitchen table with my phone recording, just as Chloe had taught me, and that every word she'd just said was being captured in real time. She had crossed from financial fraud into criminal territory, and she'd done it voluntarily, on a recorded line, because she was frightened and desperate and had fundamentally misjudged who she was dealing with. The dignity required to stay calm in that moment was enormous. Every instinct in me wanted to shout, to cry, to tell her exactly how shamed and humiliated and violated that threat made me feel. But I had learned something over the past weeks. Emotion is expensive in a war like this. Every tear, every raised voice, every cracked composure is a gift to the people trying to break you. So I breathed. I said, "I hear you, Victoria," in a voice that gave nothing away. And when I hung up, I called Chloe and said very quietly, "She just committed extortion on a recording." What followed was a masterclass in counter-leverage. The blackmail recording was immediately documented, preserved, and cited in a new legal filing. Chloe also introduced evidence that the medical information Victoria had referenced had been accessed through Daniel's device, adding potential HIPAA violations and unauthorized access claims to an already substantial case. The threat Victoria had made to destroy my reputation had instead handed us 3 additional causes of action and a piece of evidence so damaging that their family attorney reportedly called Chloe the following morning to discuss resolution. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, because it wasn't triumphant, not yet. It was heavy. The people I had planned to spend holidays with, to grow old alongside, to call family, had threatened to use my most private vulnerabilities as a weapon against me. That's not just legal wrongdoing. That's a specific, intimate cruelty that leaves a mark. But I also knew, sitting in that kitchen with the recording saved in 3 separate locations, that the mark they'd made on me was nothing compared to the mark we were about to make on them. Legally, financially, and permanently. Almost a month after I walked out of that ballroom, I didn't get the call I expected. I expected fire, another threat, another post, another maneuver. What I got instead, 11 days after the extortion recording was filed, was a very brief, very formal email from the Hargroves' new attorney, a different firm from the one they'd been using, which told its own story, requesting a settlement conference. Chloe read it to me over the phone in a tone of voice that I can only describe as quiet satisfaction. The sound of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what that email meant. They were done. The negotiation took 6 hours across 2 days. I wasn't in the room. Chloe handled it directly. But she called me after every significant exchange. The Hargroves had 3 priorities: protect Daniel from criminal referral, protect Victoria from extortion prosecution, and keep the family name out of the Tribune's business section, which Chloe had casually mentioned to their attorney was covering local real estate fraud cases. Those 3 fears were our entire leverage, and we used every inch of them. The final terms were better than I had dared to let myself hope for in those early morning hours at my kitchen table, staring at highlighted bank statements. The townhouse was quick-claimed entirely into my name, sole ownership, clean deed, no competing interest. A restitution payment of the full $42,000 plus a negotiated share of the property's appreciation since purchase was wired to my account within 10 business days. A formal non-disparagement agreement, with significant financial penalties for violation, was signed by Daniel, Victoria, and Richard individually, and a provision requiring the deletion of all personal data, medical records, and private communications wrongfully obtained was included with verification requirements. They signed everything, every page. Without a fight, because the fight had already happened, in spreadsheets and recordings and legal filings and 47 minutes of dinner audio that they never knew existed. The payback wasn't a scene. It wasn't a speech in a ballroom. It was a stack of documents sitting in a county recorder's office with my name on them, clean and permanent and absolutely irrefutable. The vengeance I'd wanted, real, structural, lasting, hadn't looked anything like what I'd imagined when I was standing in that engagement party trying not to shatter a champagne flute. Justice, I've come to understand, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives very quietly, in the form of a wire transfer confirmation and a signed agreement, and it leaves behind something you didn't know you'd been missing. The specific, bone-deep piece of a ledger that has finally been balanced. But the story didn't end with the documents, because I had $42,000, a clean deed, and a very clear sense of what I wanted to do with both. I sold the townhouse 4 months later, not because I needed to, I owned it outright, but because I needed to. There's a difference. Every room in that place held the archaeology of a version of my life I was no longer interested in excavating. The tiles I'd chosen, the hallway I'd painted, the kitchen table where I'd sat at midnight with a highlighter learning what betrayal looks like in an Excel spreadsheet. I needed all of it to belong to someone else's story. So I sold it, cleanly and at a good number, and I didn't look back. The money went into 3 places. A portion into a personal account that was mine entirely, with no joint holders and no trust structures and no one's name on it but my own. A portion into legal fees and administrative costs for what would become the Prenup Project, a nonprofit I incorporated in the spring, designed to provide free legal literacy resources to women navigating property, prenuptial agreements, and financial transparency in relationships. And a small portion, deliberately, into a fund I named after nothing and no one. Just a quiet reserve that existed purely as proof that I could build something from nothing and protect it. The Prenup Project got its first donor within 2 weeks of launching, a woman who had found my story through a mutual connection and sent an email saying simply, "I wish this had existed 3 years ago." That email broke me open in a way the entire legal battle never had. The grant applications followed, then a keynote at a women's financial summit in the city, where I stood at a podium and talked about the audit, the recordings, the screenshots, the settlement. Not as a sob story, but as a field guide. As a map. As proof that the system can be used for you if you learn its language before someone else weaponizes it against you. I won't pretend that the emotional healing was as tidy as the legal victory. Karmic resolution on paper doesn't automatically dissolve the nights you spent wondering how you missed the signs, or the specific grief of loving someone who was performing love while planning a trap. That grief is real, and it takes its own time. But I stopped waiting for Daniel to apologize. I stopped wanting Victoria to understand. I stopped needing any of them to acknowledge what they had done, because their acknowledgement was never the source of my dignity. I had been carrying that myself the entire time, even when I didn't know it. The last thing I did, the ritual I'd been saving for the right moment, was drive to the coast on a Saturday morning in October, walk to the water's edge, and drop a single folded piece of paper into the waves. It was the printout of Daniel's group chat screenshot, the one where he'd bragged about setting a trap. I watched the water take it, and I stood there until it was completely gone. and then I turned around and walked back to my car. No ceremony, no speech, no audience. Just the quiet, clean, absolute feeling of a chapter that was finished. I didn't escape a trap. I learned how it was built, and then I dismantled it, brick by brick, on my own terms. So let me ask you something before you go. Have you ever sat across from someone at a dinner table? Someone who smiled at you, who said the right words, who made you feel like you were home, and only realized much later that the whole thing was a performance? Have you ever been so close to a situation that you couldn't see it clearly until the moment you walked away from it? Because that's what happened to me. And if you've ever been cheated, lied to, or backstabbed by someone you trusted, especially someone you loved, then you know that the most disorienting part isn't the betrayal itself. It's the moment you realize how long it had been happening while you were still calling it love. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted had been running a very different game behind the scenes? Or maybe you've had your own audit moment, the night you sat down, pulled out the documents, and saw the truth for the very first time. Whatever your story is, this is the space for it. Your reflection, your experience, your version of justice. It matters here, and someone reading these comments needs to see it. And if this story made you feel something, if it woke something up, validated something, or made you think differently about what you accept in the name of tradition, love, or family loyalty, then please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because the women who find the prenup project always say the same thing. I wish I'd known sooner. Maybe you can make sure someone in your life doesn't have to say that. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because we're not done. What's coming next will go even deeper into the hidden financial structures that trap people in relationships that look like love and function like contracts. The stories are real, the stakes are high. And the next one? You're not going to see it coming. Neither did I.